Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're going to map out the profoundly human and, honestly, deeply unsettling truth behind the catastrophic moral panic of 1692. We're talking about the Salem Witch Trials, of course. But, forget the ghost stories you've heard around the campfire. What actually went down is way more fascinating and, frankly, a whole lot more terrifying.
First things first, we really need to shatter those pop culture illusions. You know the ones. The stuff from Arthur Miller's The Crucible or your favorite Halloween movies. There were absolutely no mysterious broomsticks here, no bubbling cauldrons, and get this, contrary to popular belief, literally no one was burned at the stake in Salem. The reality? These were just ordinary people. We're talking agrarian farmers and devoutly religious citizens who somehow got completely swallowed up in a systemic judicial failure of epic proportions. All right, moving right along to Section 1, Dismantling the Halloween Myth. Let's look closely at the actual historical toll this hysteria took on the community. The real story here is just a deeply human tragedy. And the victims weren't magical outcasts. 19 individuals were hanged on a rocky ledge near Gallows Hill. One man was pressed to death, and at least 5 others, including infants, actually perished in the freezing, disease-ridden stone dungeons of New England just waiting for a trial. But maybe the most heartbreaking part of the whole shebang, the youngest accused was a 4-year-old child named Dorothy Good, and she was literally kept in chains. So the main takeaway here is that devout church members, tavern keepers, and even vulnerable little kids were systematically destroyed by their own neighbors.
Let's dive into Section 2, the Salem pressure cooker. Now you might be wondering, how on earth does a community just turn on itself like this? Well, the answer really lies in an explosive socioeconomic divide. Think of it like a giant powder keg. On one side, you had Salem town, coastal, progressive, packed with wealthy merchants profiting off sea trade. But just a few miles inland, you had Salem Village. These were struggling agrarian farmers, highly conservative Puritans, extremely vulnerable economically, and basically subjugated to the town. And inside the village, there was this bitter feud raging between 2 main families, the traditionalist struggling Putnams and the wealthy progressive Porters. The Putnams actually went out and recruited a super rigid Orthodox minister named Reverend Samuel Parris, and his fiery sermons all about internal enemies working for the devil? Yeah, that was the match that lit the powder keg.
But it wasn't just about money or class, right? The psychological landscape of this place was deeply scarred. The colonists were dealing with profound trauma from King William's war against the Wabanaki Confederacy out on the frontier. Salem Village was practically flooded with traumatized refugees who had witnessed horrific massacres. Refugees like Mercy Lewis, who, by the way, would later become one of the key accusers. Add to all that a complete political limbo. They lost the Massachusetts Bay Charter in 1684, which basically meant their land titles and their whole government were completely up in the air. Oh, and remember, these Puritans believed in a literal, physical devil who was actively working out in the woods to destroy their holy experiment.
Which brings us to Section 3, the spark of hysteria.
By the freezing winter of 1691, this community was a pressure cooker just waiting to rupture. It started in Reverend Parris's own parsonage. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began having these violent, unnatural fits, throwing things around, contorting their bodies. So, by February 1692, the local physician Dr. Griggs is brought in. He can't find a physical cause, so he diagnoses them as being under an evil hand. Witchcraft. And then, out of sheer desperation, a well-meaning neighbor actually had an enslaved servant bake a folk magic witch cake. This thing was made using rye meal and the girl's urine. Yeah, a highly questionable choice that completely backfired and only escalated the panic, leading to formal public inquiries by March and the setup of a special court by May.
Under intense pressure to name whoever was tormenting them, the girls pointed their fingers straight at the most marginalized outsiders they could find. They named Tituba, an enslaved South American Indian woman, Sarah Good, who's a destitute, unpopular beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who scandalously hadn't been to church in years. Now, Good and Osborne fiercely denied everything, but Tituba, she realized she had absolutely zero legal protection, so she did the unthinkable. She confessed. She spun this incredibly vivid, terrifying tale about a Boston man, yellow birds, and red cats, and claimed Good and Osborne were her co-conspirators. For the Puritans, this confession was the smoking gun. It validated their absolute worst fears of an active, satanic conspiracy.
Okay, Section 4, Spectral Evidence and Tragedies.
Once Tituba's confession broke the dam, accusations started spreading from the outcasts right to respected church members. And this exposes the fundamental legal flaw of the entire tragedy: spectral evidence. Under Chief Magistrate William Stoughton, the court actually allowed the admission of dreams and visions as absolute physical proof. Their logic was that the devil couldn't take an innocent person's shape without their permission. So if an afflicted girl claimed your invisible specter or spirit was, say, biting her from the ceiling across the room, a physical alibi meant absolutely nothing. You literally couldn't prove you weren't doing it because only the accuser could see it.
As you can imagine, this created a deeply distorted system. It was an impossible dilemma for the accused. The court essentially engineered a mechanism designed entirely to manufacture guilt. If you maintained your innocence and fought the charges, you were found guilty and sentenced to hang. But if you broke down, confessed, and scapegoated other people, the court kept you alive so you could help the prosecution. So fighting meant certain death, but weeping and blaming your neighbors meant survival. Talk about a nightmare scenario.
We see the horrific results of this systemic failure in some truly heartbreaking individual stories. Take Bridget Bishop, the very first person to hang. She was simply a flashy, independent iconoclast who wore a red bodice and owned taverns. Or Rebecca Nurse. She was a 71-year-old, saintly matriarch. The jury actually found her not guilty at first, but Judge Stoughton openly bullied them into changing their verdict. Then there's Reverend George Burroughs. Right at the gallows, he perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer. Now, Puritans believed a witch was physically incapable of doing that. The crowd was stunned and almost stopped the execution, until the highly influential minister Cotton Mather intervened on horseback, claiming the devil could appear as an angel of light. So Burroughs was hanged anyway.
And then there's one of the most incredible acts of defiance in American history. 81-year-old farmer Giles Corey. He knew that if he stood trial, he'd be found guilty, and the corrupt sheriff Corwin would seize his entire estate, leaving his kids with absolutely nothing. So to prevent the trial from even happening, Corey just stood mute. He refused to plead. To force a plea out of him, the court subjected him to a torture called peine forte et dure. They placed a heavy board on his chest and stacked massive, crushing stones on top of him for 2 whole days. Whenever they asked him to plead to save his own life, his only response was, "More weight." He was literally crushed to death, but you know what? He successfully protected his family's inheritance.
Moving on to our final section, aftermath and modern theories.
By the autumn of 1692, the panic finally began to consume itself. It hit a breaking point when the girls actually accused the governor's own wife. No way that was going to fly. So in October, Harvard's president, Reverend Increase Mather, penned this devastating critique of spectral evidence. He argued, and I quote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that 1 innocent person should be condemned." This undeniable logic forced Governor William Phipps to finally step in. He banned spectral evidence completely and dissolved the court. And without that invisible evidence, the prosecution's cases instantly collapsed.
What followed was a profound wave of collective grief and guilt. In 1697, during a day of fasting, Judge Samuel Sewall literally stood up in church and publicly confessed his guilt and shame. He was the only judge to ever do so. Later, in 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the main afflicted girls, apologized to the congregation, claiming she was just deluded by Satan. But the tragic irony? Many of the pardoned survivors were kept trapped in jail for years afterward. Why? Simply because they couldn't afford to pay the private jail fees for their own food and the very shackles that held them. Just unbelievable.
So this brings us to the ultimate question. Looking back after more than 300 years, what actually caused the Salem Witch Trials?
Well, historians and scientists have spent centuries decoding this, and they've narrowed it down to a few compelling theories. Back in 1976, Linda Copperell suggested ergot poisoning. The idea was that the town was essentially tripping on a hallucinogenic LSD-like fungus growing on their rye bread. It's a wildly fascinating idea, but most experts today actually discount it. Ergot is highly toxic and would have affected whole families, not just a select group of teenage girls. Today, the consensus leans heavily toward mass psychogenic illness, where extreme, prolonged trauma from the frontier wars actually manifested as physical symptoms within a tight-knit peer group. Combine that with the socioeconomic exploitation famously mapped by historians Boyer and Nissenbaum. It shows how the struggling agrarian Putnam faction systematically accused members of the wealthy Porter trade network. Basically, it was geographic class warfare cloaked in spiritual panic.
You know, the term witch hunt gets thrown around a lot these days, but its actual definition is incredibly specific. A true witch hunt isn't just an aggressive or controversial investigation, it is a total systemic failure. It happens when a community, driven by irrational fear, creates a completely imaginary threat. They establish a legal mechanism where proving your innocence is literally impossible, they reward scapegoating, and they immediately target anyone who calls for caution. It is the absolute, total abandonment of due process and the presumption of innocence.
And that leaves us with a pretty chilling final thought. The tragedy of Salem is that the people of 1692 weren't unique monsters. They were just traumatized, vulnerable, and deeply afraid people, desperately trying to protect their community. But their fear completely blinded them to reason. The line between order and hysteria is always paper thin. So we really have to ask ourselves, looking at our modern society, what imaginary threats are we allowing to compromise our own empathy and justice today?
Please like and subscribe.